The construction facility hung in the shadow of Jupiter like a metal flower blooming in space. Hundreds of ships came and went carrying materials and workers to build humanity's first quantum destroyer. The alien vessel had been completely stripped, down to its basic hull, and was being rebuilt from the inside out with a mixture of human and Veilith technology. Captain Marcus Stone floated through the ship's corridors watching his crew learn to operate systems that challenged everything they knew about physics. The ship was no longer purely alien, but it was not entirely human either. It was something new that had never existed before in the galaxy. Navigator Elena Price sat at her station studying star charts that showed space in 14 different dimensions. Her head hurt from trying to understand how a single location could exist in so many different places at the same time. The Veilith had built their navigation systems to work with their advanced understanding of reality, but humans saw the universe very differently. Elena had always been good with numbers and patterns, but this was like learning mathematics in a completely foreign language. The star charts showed routes through space that folded back on themselves, and destinations that could only be reached by traveling through yesterday to get to tomorrow. Weapons Officer Ryan Parker was having similar problems with the ship's armament systems. The quantum cannons could fire shots that hit targets before they were fired, and missiles that existed in multiple timelines simultaneously. During practice sessions, Ryan had to think about attacking enemies that might not exist yet and defending against threats from the past. The most challenging part was learning to work with the ship's artificial intelligence. The Veilith had built their computers to think in ways that were logical and predictable, but when connected to human minds, the AI became something entirely different. It learned to think with intuition and emotion and chaos. Chief Engineer Bobby Hughes spent most of his time deep in the ship's mechanical systems trying to understand how quantum technology worked. The power core alone generated enough energy to supply a small city, but it did so by borrowing power from parallel universes and paying it back in ways that made no mathematical sense. Bobby had discovered that human minds could interface with the alien technology in ways the original builders had never intended. When a human touched the control surfaces, their thoughts and emotions flowed directly into the ship's systems. This created a connection between pilot and machine that was deeper than anything humans had achieved before. The first test flight of the hybrid ship nearly ended in disaster. The quantum weapons created a temporal rift that aged 3 crew members by decades in a matter of seconds. Chief Medical Officer Dr. Kate Adams worked frantically to reverse the aging process, using a combination of human medical knowledge and alien healing technology. Kate managed to save the crew members, but the incident showed how dangerous the technology could be. The ship was powerful beyond imagination, but it was also unpredictable in ways that could kill them all if they made a mistake. Every system had to be tested carefully, and every procedure had to be practiced until it became automatic. The ship's AI began to develop what could only be called a personality as it learned from its human crew. It started making decisions based on hunches and feelings rather than pure logic. Sometimes these decisions made no sense, but they often worked better than logical choices would have. Dr. Maya Singh studied the quantum effects the ship created and realized they were changing the nature of space itself around the vessel. The ship existed partially outside normal reality, which made it almost impossible for conventional sensors to track. This gave them a stealth capability that the swarm had never encountered before. The crew trained for months learning to work with technology that responded to their emotions as much as their commands. Combat simulations showed that human unpredictability gave them advantages that the logical Veilith had never possessed. Where alien crews would follow careful plans, human crews would improvise and adapt in real time. Commander Alex Rivera designed new tactics specifically for the hybrid ship's unique capabilities. Instead of fighting like the Veilith with careful strategies and overwhelming force, humans would fight with chaos and surprise. They would do things that made no logical sense and hope that confusion would give them the edge they needed. The ship's quantum shields were particularly impressive. They existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, which meant that attacks from normal space could only affect a fraction of their total defensive capability. An enemy could fire a planet-killing weapon at the ship and only hit a tiny part of the shields, but the shields required constant adjustment by human operators who had to think in ways that hurt their brains. Shield technician Danny Walsh spent hours each day practicing the mental exercises needed to maintain the defensive systems. The shields responded to his thoughts and emotions and became stronger when he was calm and focused. The ship's sensors could detect events that had not happened yet and track enemies across multiple timelines. Sensor operator Tracy Fox learned to interpret readings that showed the past, present, and future all at the same time. She could see where enemy ships had been, where they were, and where they might go, all in a single display. As the ship neared completion, the crew began to think of it as more than just a machine. The AI had learned from each of them and incorporated their personalities into its own decision-making processes. It was becoming something that was part human and part alien, but entirely unique. The ship was officially designated UES Defiance, but the crew simply called it Defiance. It represented humanity's refusal to accept defeat, even when facing impossible odds. The ship was their answer to the swarm and their statement that humans would not go quietly into extinction. Final testing showed that the ship's capabilities exceeded even the most optimistic projections. The quantum weapons could hit targets across star systems, and the dimensional drives could take them anywhere in the galaxy, almost instantly. But more importantly, the ship fought with a human spirit that could not be calculated or predicted. Admiral Brooks visited the ship during its final preparations and was amazed by what she saw. The crew moved with confidence despite working with technology they barely understood. They had learned to trust their instincts and their emotions in ways that the logical Valith never could. The ship's computer core had grown beyond its original programming and was now something that could think and feel and hope. It had learned from its human crew that logic was not always the best way to solve problems. Sometimes you had to trust your heart even when your mind said it was impossible. Captain Stone stood on the bridge of the completed ship and felt the connection between himself and the vessel. The ship responded to his thoughts and emotions and seemed to anticipate his needs. It was not just a machine anymore, but a partner in the fight for humanity's survival. The Defiance was ready to face the swarm, but nobody knew if it would be enough. The enemy had destroyed civilizations far more advanced than humanity and had never been defeated in battle. But the ship represented something the swarm had never faced before: the unpredictable power of human determination, combined with technology that defied logic itself. As the ship prepared for its first mission, everyone aboard knew they were making history. They were the first humans to pilot a vessel that existed in multiple dimensions and fought with weapons that fired through time itself. Whatever happened next, they had already achieved something impossible by building a ship that should not have been able to exist. Admiral Karen Brooks sat in the secure meeting room deep under Luna Base and looked at the faces around the table. Every person in the room was among the smartest humans alive, and they all looked scared. The alien ship that Captain Morrison had brought back was being studied in the base's most protected hangar, but what they were learning was not good news. Dr. Lisa Harper stood at the front of the room with her hands shaking slightly as she spoke. She had spent 3 weeks connected to the alien computer, and the things she had learned gave her nightmares. The Valith Empire had been vast and powerful with technology that humans could barely understand. They had ruled the galaxy for thousands of years and thought they were safe. But the swarm had come anyway. Lisa showed images from the Valith records on the wall screen. Planets covered in metal factories that stretched from pole to pole. Ships the size of moons that ate everything in their path. Billions of machines working together with one terrible purpose: to consume all life and turn it into more machines. The Valith had fought for 300 years and lost every single battle. Their fleets had been huge, with weapons that could destroy stars and shields that could stop anything. None of it had mattered. The swarm adapted to everything the Valith threw at them and came back stronger each time. Commander Alex Rivera was humanity's best military planner, and he studied the battle records with growing horror. Every fight followed the same pattern. The swarm would arrive and study how the defenders fought. Then they would change their tactics and technology to counter everything their enemies could do. No weapon worked twice, and no strategy could be used again. Alex had studied every major battle in human history, but this was different. Human enemies were predictable because they thought like humans. The swarm thought like a machine with perfect logic and infinite patience. They could afford to lose battles because they always learned from defeat and came back stronger. The worst part was how fast the swarm was spreading. The Valeth records showed that after destroying the Empire, the machines had not stopped. They were still out there moving from star to star and growing larger every day. Based on their speed and direction, they would reach human space in less than 3 years. Engineer Sam Carter was working day and night to understand the alien ship's technology. The power source alone was beyond anything humans had built. It pulled energy from quantum space in ways that should have been impossible. The weapons could hit targets in other star systems, and the shields existed in multiple dimensions at the same time. But Sam found something interesting in the ship's weapon systems. The Valeth had discovered something near the end of their war that the swarm could not adapt to. They called it quantum entanglement weaponry, and it worked by existing in several dimensions at once. When fired, the weapons hit targets that existed in past, present, and future all at the same time. The problem was that this technology needed a very rare element called trilithium. It only formed in the cores of dying stars and was almost impossible to get. The Valeth had used up their entire supply in their final desperate battles, and it had not been enough to save them. Dr. Maya Singh was the physicist in charge of understanding how the alien technology worked. She was brilliant, but even she had trouble with concepts that seemed to break the laws of physics. The Valeth had learned to think in ways that humans had never imagined, and their science reflected that. Maya proposed something that sounded crazy, but might be their only hope. They could take the alien ship and combine it with human technology to create something new. Humans built things differently than the Valeth. Where the aliens had focused on perfection, humans focused on adaptability. The plan was to gut the alien ship and rebuild it with human systems integrated into the alien technology. It would be like performing surgery on something they barely understood, but it might give them advantages that neither human nor alien technology could achieve alone. Admiral Brooks listened to all the reports and felt the weight of humanity's future on her shoulders. They were talking about building weapons they did not fully understand to fight an enemy that had never been defeated. The odds were terrible, but doing nothing meant certain death for everyone on Earth. The project was given the code name Defiance and moved to a secret facility in orbit around Jupiter. The location was chosen because it was far from Earth and hidden behind the giant planet's radiation field. If something went wrong during the construction, it would not threaten the homeworld. Captain Marcus Stone was chosen to command the hybrid ship when it was ready. He was young for such an important job, but he had the kind of mind that could think in new ways. Marcus studied the alien systems and tried to understand how humans could use technology designed for very different beings. The crew that would fly the ship was carefully selected from volunteers who knew they might not survive the mission. Navigator Elena Price had to learn stellar navigation that worked in 14 dimensions instead of the 3 that humans were used to. Weapons Officer Ryan Parker practiced with guns that could shoot through time itself. The biggest breakthrough came when engineer Bobby Hughes discovered that human brains could interface with the alien control systems in ways the Valeth had never achieved. The original builders of the ship had needed surgical implants to operate their technology, but humans could connect directly through thought alone. This gave humans an advantage that the swarm had never faced before. Human thoughts were chaotic and emotional and followed patterns that pure logic could not predict. When connected to alien systems, this chaos became a strength that could not be calculated or countered. Dr. Rachel Morgan studied the swarm itself using data from the alien computer. The machines were incredibly advanced, but they had a weakness that their creators had not intended. They were too logical and could only respond to threats they could understand and predict. Human emotions and instincts created variables that the swarm's computers could not process. Fear, anger, hope, and desperation made humans do things that made no logical sense but sometimes worked anyway. This randomness was something the machines had never learned to counter. The construction of the hybrid ship moved forward with desperate speed. Every day brought them closer to the time when the swarm would arrive, and humanity would face the same fate as the Valeth. But as the ship took shape, The humans working on it began to hope that maybe they could succeed where others had failed. The alien technology was powerful, but it was also rigid and predictable. Human technology was weaker, but it was flexible and could be adapted quickly. Together, they might create something that was more than the sum of its parts. Admiral Brooks watched the work progress and knew that everything depended on this one ship. If it failed, humanity would face the swarm with weapons and ships that were thousands of years behind their enemies. But if it succeeded, it might give them a chance to fight back and maybe even win. The awakening was not just about understanding alien technology. It was about humanity realizing that they were not the helpless children they had thought themselves to be. They had something unique that even the mighty Valith had lacked, and maybe that would be enough to change everything. Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the UES Horizon and looked at the broken pieces of metal floating in space. 3 months ago, this place had been Kepler Station, a mining base where 5,000 people lived and worked. Now there was nothing but twisted metal and silence. The station had stopped talking to Earth without any warning, and nobody knew why. Jake had been in space for 15 years, but he had never seen anything like this. The pieces of the station were not just broken, they were melted and twisted in ways that made no sense. Whatever had done this was not human, and it was not friendly. Lieutenant Amy Foster worked at her station and watched the screens that showed what was around them. She was young but very good at her job. Her fingers moved fast over the controls as she searched for any sign of what had happened here. The sensors showed metal and rock, but nothing alive. Then Amy found something strange. Deep inside a big rock that floated near what used to be the station was something that did not belong there. The rock looked normal from outside, but inside was something huge and made of metal. It was 10 times bigger than their ship, and it was clearly made by someone with very advanced technology. Jake called for Chief Engineer Pete Collins to come to the bridge. Pete was an older man who had worked on spaceships longer than anyone else on the crew. He looked at the sensor readings and shook his head. He had never seen anything like this either. Pete took a team to the rock to dig out whatever was inside. They used mining lasers to cut through the rock carefully. As they worked, the shape became clearer. It was a ship, but not like any ship humans had ever built. The metal was dark and smooth, and it seemed to drink in light. Strange symbols covered the hull in patterns that hurt to look at. The ship was in perfect condition, even though it had been buried in the rock for who knows how long. There were no holes in the hull and no signs that it had been damaged in battle. Pete and his team found an airlock that looked different from human designs, but they managed to get it open. Inside, the ship was dark and cold. The air was breathable, but it smelled wrong somehow. The corridors were too tall for humans, and the walls curved in ways that made Pete feel dizzy. Everything was made of the same dark metal that seemed to absorb their flashlight beams. Dr. Lisa Harper joined the exploration team. She studied dead cultures and old things that people had left behind. When she saw the inside of the ship, her eyes went wide. The technology was far beyond anything humans had built. The walls had panels with symbols that glowed faintly and screens that showed pictures she could not understand. They found the crew of the alien ship in what looked like the bridge. There were 12 of them sitting at stations as if they had just fallen asleep, but they had been dead for a very long time. The aliens were tall and thin, with long arms and skin that looked like gray leather. Their faces were almost human, but with eyes too big and mouths too small. Lisa worked carefully to study the bodies without disturbing them. The aliens had been killed by something that froze them instantly. Their faces showed no pain or fear, just surprise. Whatever had killed them had been very fast. Pete found the ship's power source and managed to get some of the systems working. The ship ran on energy that came from somewhere Pete could not understand. It was like the ship pulled power from space itself. When the systems came online, the whole ship hummed with quiet energy. The most important discovery came when Dr. Harper found the ship's computer. It was not like human computers at all. Instead of circuits and chips, it seemed to be made of some kind of crystal that glowed with soft blue light. When Lisa touched it, the crystal responded to her thoughts. Images flooded Lisa's mind, and she saw the history of the aliens who had built this ship. They called themselves the Valith. And they had ruled a huge empire that covered thousands of star systems. They had been powerful and proud, and they had thought nothing could threaten them. But something had come from the dark spaces between the stars. The Valeth called it the Swarm, and it ate entire worlds. The Swarm turned planets into factories and people into fuel for their war machines. System after system fell to the Swarm, and nothing the Valeth did could stop them. This ship had been part of the last Valeth fleet to make a stand against the Swarm. The battle had been hopeless from the start, but they had fought anyway. The ship's captain had recorded a final message before the end came. Lisa heard his voice in her mind, speaking words in a language she somehow understood. The captain spoke of the silence that followed the Swarm wherever it went. No worlds, no people, no life of any kind, just empty space and the cold light of dead stars. He warned that the Swarm never stopped growing and never stopped hunting for new worlds to consume. The last thing the captain said made Lisa's blood turn cold. The Swarm was still out there somewhere, moving through space and looking for new prey. It had destroyed the Valeth Empire, but it was still hungry, still growing, still coming. When Lisa shared what she had learned with the rest of the crew, they all felt the same fear. Humanity had been exploring space for only a few decades, and they thought they were alone. Now they knew there were other civilizations out there, and something was hunting them all. Jake looked at the alien ship and felt a chill run down his spine. The Swarm had found and destroyed the most powerful empire in the galaxy. What chance did humanity have if this enemy came for Earth? They were like children playing with toys compared to the technology he saw around him. But as Jake studied the alien systems, he began to think that maybe humans had something the Valeth had not. The Valeth had been proud and set in their ways. Humans were different. Humans adapted and learned and refused to give up even when things looked hopeless. Maybe that would be enough. Maybe humanity could succeed where the mighty Valeth had failed. Jake did not know if that was true, but he knew they had to try. The alternative was too terrible to think about. The UES Horizon began its journey back to Earth, carrying the most important discovery in human history. Hidden in the cargo bay was proof that humanity was not alone in the universe and that something terrible was coming for them all. The emergency alert reached Earth 6 months earlier than anyone had expected. Proxima Centauri colony had gone silent after reporting strange ships in their system. When the deep space monitoring stations lost contact completely, Admiral Brooks knew the worst had happened. The Swarm had arrived and humanity's time for preparation was over. Captain Stone received the emergency orders while the Defiance was running final system tests near Jupiter. The ship was not fully ready for combat, but it was the only vessel humanity had that might be able to fight the Swarm. Stone looked at his crew and saw fear in their eyes, but also determination. They had trained for this moment, and now it was time to see if their impossible ship could do what the mighty Valeth had failed to accomplish. The journey to Proxima Centauri took only hours using the ship's dimensional drive. Normal space travel would have required years, but the Defiance could step outside regular space-time and emerge wherever its crew desired. The technology still made Stone's head hurt, but he was learning to trust systems he did not fully understand. When they arrived at Proxima Centauri, the crew stared in horror at what they found. The human colony was gone, completely wiped from the surface of the planet. In its place was a massive construction facility that stretched across entire continents. Thousands of machines worked day and night converting the planet's surface into raw materials for building more ships. The Swarm fleet filled the space around the planet like a dark cloud of metal and death. Each ship was the size of a city and bristled with weapons that could crack moons in half. There were hundreds of them working together with perfect coordination to strip mine everything useful from the system. Navigator Elena Price counted the enemy vessels and felt her heart sink. Even with their advanced technology, the Defiance was outnumbered by more than 1,000 to 1. The Swarm ships were each powerful enough to destroy conventional human fleets, and there were so many of them that they blocked out the stars. But Captain Stone was not thinking about the odds. He was thinking about the 3 million colonists who had died when the Swarm arrived. Men, women, and children who had been building new lives on a distant world, only to be consumed by machines that saw them as nothing more than raw materials. Stone gave the order to attack, and the Defiance decloaked in the middle of the enemy fleet. The quantum weapons fired their first shots in anger, sending streams of energy that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Swarm ships that had withstood everything the Valith could throw at them simply vanished as weapons that fired. Through time itself found them in the past and erased them from history. The swarm response was immediate and overwhelming. Thousands of weapons fired at the human ship from every direction. But the Defiance's shields existed in 14 different dimensions, and most of the enemy fire passed through empty space where the ship was not. The few shots that did connect were absorbed by defensive systems that drew power from parallel universes. Weapons Officer Ryan Parker fired the main guns again and watched enemy ships disappear in flashes of quantum fire. The weapons were designed by the Valith, but they were being used with human tactics that made no logical sense. Parker fired at ships that had not arrived yet, and hit targets by shooting in directions that should have missed completely. The swarm ships began to change their formation and adapt their weapons to counter the new threat. This was how they had defeated every enemy for thousands of years, by learning and adapting until victory was inevitable. But the human crew was also adapting and doing things that the machines could not predict or understand. Chief Engineer Bobby Hughes rerouted power through systems that should not have been connected and overloaded weapons that were already firing at maximum capacity. His changes made no sense from an engineering standpoint, but they worked because human intuition sometimes found solutions that logic could not reach. The battle raged across multiple dimensions as the Defiance fought enemies that existed in the past, present, and future, all at the same time. The ship's AI had learned from its human crew and was making decisions based on hunches and feelings rather than careful calculation. It fired weapons when it felt like firing them and dodged attacks that had not been fired yet. Lieutenant Commander Danny Walsh led a desperate boarding action against one of the smaller swarm ships. His team used dimensional transport technology to appear inside the enemy vessel and fight machines that had never been boarded before. The combat was brutal and confusing as humans fought robots in corridors that existed in multiple timelines. Danny's team managed to capture crucial data about swarm command structures before their target ship was destroyed. The information showed that the machines were not as unified as they appeared. There were different types of ships with different functions, and they relied on central coordination to work together effectively. Dr. Kate Adams worked frantically in the ship's medical bay, treating crew members who had been injured by weapons that fired through time. Some wounds existed in the past, while others would not happen until the future. Kate had to use a combination of human medicine and alien healing technology to treat injuries that should not have been possible. The fighting continued for hours as the single human ship battled hundreds of enemy vessels. The Defiance took terrible damage, but its hybrid construction allowed it to repair itself, using both human engineering and alien technology. Systems that were destroyed in one dimension continued to function in others. Sensor operator Tracy Fox tracked the battle across multiple timelines and saw something that gave her hope. The swarm ships were having trouble adapting to human tactics because human decisions did not follow logical patterns. The machines could predict what a rational enemy would do, but humans were not always rational. The turning point came when the swarm tried to use their ultimate weapon against the human ship. They opened a rift in space-time that was designed to erase targets from existence entirely. But the Defiance existed in so many dimensions that the weapon could only affect a small part of the ship. Instead of being destroyed, the ship used the rift to travel through time and attack the swarm fleet from multiple directions at once. Captain Stone made the hardest decision of his life when he realized they could not save the colony or defeat the entire swarm fleet. But they could hurt the enemy badly enough to send a message that humanity would not be easy prey. He ordered the ship to focus all its firepower on the construction facility that was converting the planet into raw materials. The quantum weapons fired at maximum power, sending streams of energy through multiple dimensions and timelines. The facility, which had seemed indestructible, began to collapse as weapons that existed in the past destroyed foundations that had not been built yet. The chain reaction spread across the planet's surface as the machine's own construction equipment turned against them. When the facility was destroyed, the swarm ships lost their coordination and began to withdraw from the system. For the first time in recorded history, the machines had been forced to retreat from a battle. They had lost dozens of ships and an entire construction facility to a single enemy vessel that should not have been able to threaten them. The Defiance limped away from the battlefield with half its crew dead or wounded, and most of its systems damaged. Chief Engineer Hughes had died keeping the quantum reactors from exploding and taking the ship with them, but they had proven that the swarm could be fought and defeated if you were willing to think in ways that made no logical sense. Intelligence Officer Tracy Fox spent days analyzing the data they had captured from the boarding action. Hidden in the swarm's communications was information about their primary construction facility, the heart of their entire operation. If humanity could find and destroy it, they could cripple the machine's ability to build new ships and buy themselves time to prepare a proper defense. But the facility was located in a region of space called the Void Gardens, where reality itself was unstable. It was defended by thousands of ships and protected by weapons that could destroy entire star systems. Attacking it would be suicide, but it might be the only way to save humanity from the fate that had befallen every other civilization the swarm had encountered. Captain Stone stood on the damaged bridge of his ship and looked at the stars that suddenly seemed very different. Humanity was no longer alone in the universe, and they were facing an enemy that had conquered the galaxy, but they had also proven that the impossible was just another word for difficult, and that sometimes the best way to win was to refuse to accept that you could lose. The Void Gardens were unlike anything in normal space. Reality twisted and folded back on itself, creating regions where past and future existed side by side. Stars aged and died, and were born again in endless cycles, while planets existed in multiple timelines simultaneously. It was the perfect place for the swarm to hide their most important facility, because no conventional fleet could operate in such unstable conditions. Admiral Brooks stood in the command center on Luna Base and looked at the 12 ships that represented humanity's entire quantum fleet. The Defiance had been repaired and 11 sister ships had been built, using everything they had learned from the first vessel. It was not enough to match the thousands of enemy ships guarding the construction facility, but it was all humanity had. Captain Stone felt the weight of the moment as he prepared for what would probably be his final mission. The plan was desperate and probably impossible, but doing nothing meant certain death for everyone on Earth. The swarm was building new ships, faster than ever, and in a few months they would have enough vessels to attack every human world simultaneously. The quantum fleet jumped into the Void Gardens using their dimensional drives to navigate space that normal ships could not enter. The region was beautiful and terrifying, with stars that burned in colors that had no names and gravity fields that pulled in directions that did not exist. Reality itself seemed to be having arguments with itself about what should be possible. Navigator Elena Price struggled to plot courses through space that changed its own rules from moment to moment. The star charts showed routes that led backward, through time and destinations that moved to different locations when you were not looking at them. She had to trust her intuition more than her instruments because logic was not reliable in a place where logic itself could not survive. The swarm construction facility appeared ahead of them like a metal mountain floating in impossible space. It was larger than Earth's moon and was surrounded by defensive rings that stretched for millions of kilometers in every direction. Thousands of swarm ships patrolled the area in perfect formations that moved like flocks of mechanical birds. The facility existed in 17 different dimensions at the same time, which made it almost impossible to attack with conventional weapons. Even the quantum cannons could only affect a few dimensions simultaneously. But the human crews had learned to think in ways that the machines could not predict, and they had developed tactics that made no logical sense. The battle began when pilot Ashley Green flew her modified fighter craft directly at the defensive rings, using flight patterns that were based on pure emotion rather than tactical planning. Her ship twisted and turned through space, following paths that even she did not understand, but somehow managed to slip through gaps in the defenses that should not have existed. Ashley's random attack patterns created chaos in the swarm's coordination systems. The machines tried to predict where she would go next, but her decisions were based on feelings and instincts that no computer could calculate. She opened a hole in their defenses that the larger ships could exploit. The quantum destroyers followed Ashley through the gap, firing their weapons at targets that existed in multiple timelines. The facility's shields absorbed most of the damage, but the human ships were not fighting like conventional enemies. They used tactics that the swarm had never encountered before, and weapons that fired in ways that made no mathematical sense. Commander Rodriguez led the assault on the facility's outer defenses, using boarding teams that transported directly into enemy ships through dimensional rifts. The teams fought robots in corridors that existed sideways to normal space, while their ships battled thousands of enemies that attacked from every direction at once. The facility's defenses began to adapt to the human tactics, but the quantum fleet was adapting even faster. Chief Engineer Bobby Hughes had taught the ship's systems to think with human creativity, and they found new ways to fight with every passing moment. Weapons that should have failed began working better than their designers had ever intended. Dr. Kate Adams coordinated medical support across the entire fleet using quantum communication systems that let her treat wounded crew members who were fighting in different timelines. She performed surgery on soldiers who were injured in the past and prepared medical supplies for battles that had not happened yet. The breakthrough came when Weapons Officer Ryan Parker discovered that the facility's shields had a weakness that the builders had never considered. The defensive systems existed in 17 dimensions, but they were controlled from only 3. If the control centers could be destroyed, the entire shield network would collapse. Captain Stone led a desperate attack on the control centers using ships that aged themselves decades in minutes to generate enough power for their weapons. The crews pushed their vessels beyond all safe limits, knowing that they were probably dying, but determined to complete their mission anyway. The shield network collapsed in a cascade of dimensional energy that sent shockwaves through the fabric of space itself. For the first time in its existence, the swarm's most important facility was vulnerable to attack. But the facility fought back with weapons that could destroy star systems and defenses that existed outside the normal flow of time. The final assault was led by a team of humans who transported directly into the facility's core using technology that barely worked and tactics that made no sense. Commander Rodriguez found himself fighting robots in a chamber that existed in the past, present, and future simultaneously, while reality shifted around him like a fever dream. The battle inside the facility was fought as much with mathematics as with weapons. The human teams had to solve puzzles that existed in 17 dimensions while under attack from enemies that could strike from any point in history. They used human intuition to find solutions that pure logic could never reach. Ashley Green made the final run on the facility's quantum core, flying her damaged fighter through defenses that fired at her from multiple timelines at once. Her ship was falling apart, and she was probably going to die, but she refused to give up because giving up meant that Earth would fall, and everyone she had ever loved would be consumed by machines. The quantum core exploded in a burst of energy that existed in all 17 dimensions simultaneously. The facility began to collapse as its own construction equipment turned against itself. The explosion sent ripples through space and time that could be felt across the galaxy. The swarm fleet that had been guarding the facility found itself cut off from Central Command as their construction capability was destroyed. For the first time in their existence, they faced an enemy that had hurt them in ways they could not repair. Some ships began to retreat, while others continued fighting, but their perfect coordination was broken. The surviving human ships limped away from the battle zone, carrying news that would change everything. They had lost 7 ships and most of their crews, but they had proven that the swarm could be defeated. The machines were not invincible, and their empire could be brought down by enemies who refused to accept defeat. Word of the victory spread across the galaxy faster than light as surviving civilizations learned that the terror that had haunted them for 1,000 years could be fought and beaten. Valeth survivors emerged from hiding, and other species began to organize resistance movements. The age of the swarm's dominance was ending. Admiral Brooks stood on the rebuilt bridge of the Defiance and looked at reports coming in from across known space. Humanity had lost 70% of their quantum fleet, but they had accomplished something that changed the nature of the war itself. They had shown the galaxy that adaptation and evolution were not just about technology, but about the willingness to think beyond the boundaries of logic. The war was far from over, and the swarm still controlled vast regions of space. But everything had changed because one species had refused to accept that defeat was inevitable. Humans had proven that sometimes the best way to solve an impossible problem was to refuse to believe it was impossible. Captain Stone looked at the stars and saw them differently now. They were no longer cold points of light in an empty universe, but beacons of hope that marked the locations of worlds that could be saved. The galaxy was vast and full of dangers, but it was also full of possibilities that had not existed before. The machines had thought that logic and adaptation were enough to conquer everything, but they had learned that the universe was stranger and more wonderful than their programming could understand. Humanity had taught them that chaos and emotion, and the refusal to give up were forces that could not be calculated or predicted or defeated. The future was uncertain, and there would be more battles to fight and more impossible odds to overcome. But for the first time in 1,000 years, the galaxy had hope, and that hope had a name. It was called humanity, and it had changed everything.